Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Today we'll be discussing the decarbonisation of the packaging industry and improving circularity in the plastic sector. My name is Sarah Laidler and I'm joined by my colleague Juliet Irma, and we'll be discussing how the plastic sector can decarbonise going forward and how key pioneering tools can help facilitate this change. I'm delighted to also welcome a guest speaker from Hilton Food Group, Andrea Jex. She is the Group Head of Procurement and will be discussing how Hilton's packaging has been assessed via the Carbon Trust Plastic Packaging Framework, which we'll be discussing later today. In today's webinar, what we'll be looking at in terms of exploring some key questions is the first we'll be looking at is how has the conversation around plastics evolved? Have we changed our ways since key movements within the industry? And how do we decarbonise a growing problem? We'll also be looking at how does plastic compare to alternative materials, and also how the plastic packaging framework can support you going forward. For those of you who may not know the Carbon Trust, it's a pleasure to welcome you onto the webinar today. The Carbon Trust is a mission-led organisation and an expert guide to net zero, bringing a purpose-led expertise from the climate change frontline. We have been pioneering decarbonisation for more than 20 years for businesses, governments and organisations around the world. We are now based most recently in our recent office in Amsterdam, and we're based across 5 continents with a mission to accelerate the move to a decarbonised future. I'd like to begin the webinar with this image on screen. I recently went to an event on circular economy and one of the presentations used this and it's affected me ever since. What this is showing you is the beginning of a linear economy that began almost 60 years ago, when the attitude was very much a celebratory over the ease of disposals. This is actually an advertisement for disposable packaging around sort of 60 years ago. In contrast of what we've seen in most recent years is a popular still from the Westminster campaign from Greenpeace, which highlighted not only how plastic pollution is a massive problem in our natural environments, but also how governments aren't dealing with this effectively in terms of improving recycling infrastructure and also exporting a large amount of waste to lower and middle income countries. So the contrast between the two images, as we can see, in the last 60 years, we're very much looking towards a circular economy where linear is no longer accepted and how governments should change and help facilitate this change as well. The conversation around plastic has very much evolved in the last few years. We've often had conversations with key clients about when this officially started for us as Carbon Trust. We can't ignore when it happened in terms of 1997 in terms of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch discovery. This actually began the involvement in microplastics research. But more recently, in terms of the Attenborough effect, as it was coined in 2017, Blue Planet actually opened a lot of doors for Carbon Trust in terms of talking about plastics, more so from a carbon footprint point of view, but more so in terms of how that compares to alternatives. Many organisations from the Blue Planet effect started considering should they move away from plastic, how that would affect their greenhouse gas emission targets, and how that would affect their consumers' attitude towards their brand. We saw that a lot in terms of how organisations, particularly some of our key clients, then started signing up to key pacts and pledges. So for instance, the WRAP UK Plastic Pact that came into 2018, followed by the Ellen MacArthur's New Plastic Economy in 2018 as well, when many organisations signed up to key pledges that involved increasing recycled content, improving recyclability or reusability, and also looking at plastic reduction at its source. Since then, in 2019, we saw the revamp of the UK Waste and Resource Strategy from 2019 to 2022, when that came into effect. We recently published an insight piece looked at the plastic packaging tax, which we'll go on to a little bit later. And also from them, the US Plastic Treaty, which is brand new in terms of its involvement from March, has been discussing in terms of key resolutions that should reduce plastic production and also more emphasis on scaling up recycling and energy from waste technologies. So one of the key questions we want to ask ourselves today is, from that development since 2017 and how that conversation around plastic has never really went away, as many people maybe thought it would, how that's changed and how we've changed our ways since then. So like I mentioned before, the plastic packaging tax came into play from the 1st of April 2022, so very recent, and this affected all manufactured and imported plastic packaging components which contain less than 30% recycled plastic. Packaging should only contain recycled plastic where it's permitted under the other regulation and food safety standards, but this tax does facilitate a change for embedding a market for a secondary recycled plastic to be more used and create more of a circular economy. We know that this method can help invigorate recycled plastics market and encourage the plastics to be effectively recycled and reincorporated. Since the plastic tax within the UK specifically, what this is doing is putting pressure on key designers in terms of brands to make sure that it is involved and they can't ignore the fact that recycled content can also have a circular solution to resources and also can potentially reduce their carbon footprint in total when compared to life cycle analysis without recycled content in comparison to virgin. We have a lot more information on that insight piece, which is available on our website should you wish to go into that in more detail. On a broader, more international way, the UN Treaty, for instance, in March 2022 had representatives from over 175 nations met in Nairobi for the UN Environment Assembly. They endorsed a resolution to end plastic pollution and forge an international legally binding agreement by the end of 2024. What was very interesting is that this resolution establishes an intergovernmental negotiating committee, which is called the INC, which will begin its work this year, aiming to complete that draft legally binding agreement by the year of 2024. As it's quite an exciting space for us to be involved in, what this looks at is the full life cycle of plastics and the design of reusable and recyclable products and materials, and the need for enhanced international collaboration to facilitate access to technology and also to develop a common ground when discussing plastic. The two main resolutions that I've previously highlighted are on two sides of the scale. So the first is capping plastic production. This has been, to maybe some people's surprise, supported by many brands and scientists and urged to accept nothing less than a cap on plastic production to minimize the impact that some countries can actually produce. There aren't any targets formed as of yet, but it's recognition that all products and materials should be able to be reused, remanufactured or recycled and therefore retained in the economy as long as possible. On the other side of the scale, we have enhancing the recycling market, which no doubt is needed to help facilitate a change. But major plastic polluting nations are less inclined for an all-out cap or ban of production. It seems that some countries which have the most to lose from this being implemented in terms of a cap on production want to focus more on the fact that the recycling market should be supported. Because I've sort of displayed them as a scales, one can't exist without the other. We must look at sort of the upstream versus the downstream. But even a cap or a ban would not improve the remaining plastic in the world that is still mismanaged. But also it's very important to highlight that the final text from the feedback from this treaty and the meeting ultimately says that each nation will be able to make its own decision based on the local context. So it won't be a one size fits all. And we have to take into account sort of the lower middle income countries and how they're developing. Some of the key progressions that we have from the UN Treaty is the fact that it is legally binding and it is completely necessary. We've seen in the conversations that we've had internally at the Carbon Trust and also conversations that we've had with clients, how confusing terminology and stances can be within the plastic sector. So having a legally binding treaty that is a common ground is completely necessary. We've also highlighted that it looks at the full life cycle of plastic, and purely focusing on the end of life of plastic's life is missing a lot of the problem. We'll go into today how the upstream impact of plastic, such as using virgin plastic, can contribute to a lot of reducing the footprint of plastics production. Also, the treaty recognises that plastic pollution poorly affects the lower and middle income countries who have a lot of reduced capacity to effectively recycle it, and that does impact their social well-being. The uncertainties that still exist around the UN Treaty is something that we've looked at in terms of what will be missing, and what will be really interesting to see over the next 2 years when this is being drafted is a financing mechanism for lower and middle income countries and how they're going to be supported. It's very important to ensure that higher income countries don't stick in their ways of shipping plastics to lower income countries which have reduced capacity and don't have the economics or facilitation to handle it. It's also important that the guidance around designing for effective recyclability is accepted at a large scale. We know from the work that we've done with many organisations that any plastic can be technically recycled through some methods. However, this isn't worth it if it's not at a larger scale or can be replicated in many areas. It's also very important that the treaty does recognise how visibility on plastic reduction goals can align with country decarbonisation. Many organisations such as ourselves have looked at this in terms of being one of the biggest agreements, environmental agreements since Paris 2015. And we know that a lot of countries have signed up to Paris 2015 and capping a 1.5 degree world. Therefore, when we take in a plastic reduction goals, it must align with that country decarbonisation and it can't be ignored. The recent report from the OECD has illustrated a policy roadmap for more circular plastics and can involve a stepped approach. Within the OECD report, the key elements that echo that of the treaty include closing leakage pathways, which is the most basic step when we start and think about how we can reduce our overall impact is reducing the actual problem itself. So it's a basic step for mitigating health hazards and plastics pollution, banning or taxing items that are frequently littered. We've seen that happen within the UK waste and resources strategy when we banned single-use items. Also creating incentives for recycling and enhancing sorting at source, so recycling plastic only occurs at a large scale if it's profitable. And restraining the demand and optimizing design. The largest environmental gains we know can be achieved from reducing some of the virgin materials and improving the product design at its source. Removing support schemes for fossil-based plastics or shale gas subsidiaries will make plastic value chains more circular by restraining the consumption and by making recycled plastics more price competitive, which we've already seen start to develop. Also looking at in terms of the recycling sector, how those changes have been implemented. If we look at that in terms of the key developments that could help bridge the gap to recycling rates and facilitate that market for recycled content. For instance, there's 3 that we have on the screen, and I could do a webinar on every single one of them and fill the hour quite well. So we're only going to cover sort of the top key highlights. So the first one that I want to mention is chemical recycling, which we know has been researched to have the potential of 3 million tonnes by 2030. This will give us a key step in terms of changing a system circularity. The process is effectively, for those who don't know, is hydrolyzing polymers to their original state, so you could effectively recycle any plastic back into a plastic. What is very good about this technology is that it should be used to tackle the hardest to address waste streams, thereby enabling circularity for things such as food packaging, films that cannot meet food safety and hygiene requirements for the mechanical recycling that we do rely on quite widely today. The technology itself actually has the potential to address those hard to recycle waste streams, but needs to be implemented correctly and with adequate policy support to avoid building out plastic to fuel routes and increasing the system's greenhouse gas emissions was a key consideration. The next is things such as digital watermarking, which looks at or enhancing sortation at the source. If you enhance sortation, it increases the quality and quantity of waste streams destined for recycling. This is something that also must be reported. Many countries have key recycling rates that they need to achieve. So enhanced sorting and separation will increase that. Strengthening sortation through advanced sorting technology and improving inefficient sorting process can further improve the purity of the waste streams and separate out polymers, thus increasing the quality and quantity of waste bills that are destined for recycling. It also impacts the process efficiencies at the recycling plant. We've seen some best technology solutions that can be available, such as digital innovation. This can be near infrared optical sorters, things such as digital watermarking, such as the Holy Grail 2.0 project, and also digital product passports, such as R-Cycle or AI-enabled advanced robotic sorting. They all can provide opportunities to increase sorting efficiencies and also further address data gaps that exist within the plastic data that we have to date. And finally, an important pillar for making circularity work is consumer behaviour. We can't ignore that. Many studies have tried and tested tools such as deposit return schemes or reuse models with varying results. We know that some of these systems and incentives work best when they're tailored to a country culture. That's why we've seen a lot of success in countries such as Germany in terms of how a deposit return scheme can work there. As long as they're financially incentive, it's able to enable the market to adjust the changing patterns to consumption that allows them to have proper handling at end of life. Consumers do have an active role to play. We've seen their involvement and engagement with plastics, and we can't ignore it, and it should be utilised to achieve plastic pollution reduction. Schemes such as these build on the engagement that we've seen, and it will allow waste to be seen as a resource rather than a waste as it has today, and further enable that circularity model. I'm now going to hand over to Juliet, who's going to go through how a growing problem can be decarbonised.
Thank you, Sarah. So yeah, essentially, now we know what we're doing. I'm going to take you through how this problem is growing and how we can decarbonise it. So the current landscape of the plastic life cycle, it's far from a circular economy. And as Sarah's already highlighted, there's been an OECD report, and they reported that globally, the annual production of plastics has doubled from 234 million tonnes in 2010 to 460 million tonnes in 2019, which is just completely unsustainable. And whilst we drive the decarbonisation of our energy grids and we take coal and oil out of our energy demand, plastic is going to remain as a key pillar holding up the petrochemical sector. And we just need to remember that we're currently not treating plastic waste as what it is, and that is an oil. Also, as production grows and recycling remains low at only 9%, 22 million tonnes of macro and microplastics are leaked into our environment. This can be seen on the right in the graph from 2019. So macroplastics, they can be defined as anything more than 5 millimeters in diameter, and microplastics are anything lower than this. So as shown in the graph, the majority of this leakage comes from mismanaged waste at 82%. So in a business as usual scenario, the greenhouse gas emissions from the plastic sector are estimated to account for 15% of the global carbon budget by 2050, and in 2014 this was only 1%. Also, forecasts from BP and IEA, they both see petrochemicals as the largest driver of expected oil demand, making up 95% and 45% of growth to 2040 respectively. It was also seen in 2020, Carbon Tracker, they highlighted that the oil industry is investing about £300 billion in producing even more virgin plastic over the next 5 years, despite all of their public pledges to reduce net carbon emissions to zero. Also, as the world starts to transition from a linear plastic system to a more circular economy, and our governments are acting to hit climate targets, our plastic demand is likely to peak. This will then lead to peak oil demand and will leave hundreds of billions of dollars of stranded petrochemical capital expenditure. So the problem with plastic is evident, and this extends beyond waste and carbon. And as Sarah mentioned, the plastic became popular for a reason. It's so durable, and everyone was so excited about it 60 years ago, but it's a double-edged sword, and it works against it when it's used incorrectly, so we need to use it for its benefits. And you cannot ignore the benefits of plastic. It can be recyclable, lightweight, cheap, and easily molded, as well as preventing food waste, amongst many other things. But we do need to draw a line between necessity and overuse, because plastic should simply not exist where it's not needed, and it should always contain recycled content and be recyclable where possible. At the Carbon Trust here, we think we take a realistic approach, and we recognise that we cannot eradicate plastic overnight because we are just so dependent on it due to the various benefits that I've mentioned. And also many of the plastic-free sustainable alternatives out there, they're just inaccessible for the majority of people's incomes, and customers should not be demonized for their choices and feeling like they cannot be sustainable enough. So to fix this problem, we just need better plastics that are more circular with responsibility across the whole value chain. So I've spoken a lot about plastic so far, so we should probably discuss how this compares to other packaging materials. So here at the Carbon Trust, we're often asked, what is the best packaging material? But it's a really hard question, and there's just no definitive answer to this, since what makes a good packaging material is so heavily dependent on the context of the product. So there's many important non-environmental factors that have to be accounted for, like the protection of the product, safety as in food safety, as well as barriers from hazardous goods, the cost, and also specific legislation that just defines what materials are needed for that product. So there are various characteristics, however, that can make packaging better from a carbon perspective, such as what we've mentioned with recycled content, recyclability, refill capacity, as well as having as low weight packaging as possible, always without compromising recyclability and breakage, and using renewable energy and sourcing closer materials. We would also always recommend that companies do comparative life cycle assessments to assess various packaging options and ensure that the best carbon choices are made, as well as testing for other factors like the impact of these on product breakage. So we've done one of these comparative studies for soft drink packaging, and we in this considered aluminium cans, single-use glass and PET bottles, and then also refillable glass and PET bottles in a European context. And the key underlying drivers from the carbon footprints in this report were the carbon intensity of the electricity used, especially for primary aluminium production, which is very intensive, as well as packaging forming. And then also the recycling rate, the recycled material content, the reuse rate for the refillables, and then also the transport and distribution distances. So this is one of the main output graphs that came from the report. And as you can see, the highest European typical footprint comes from the single-use glass. And this range also extends higher than any of the other alternatives. Aluminium cans, they do have the widest range, mainly because of the virgin impact of aluminium as well as the electricity intensity. But the typical European scenario, it does actually compare well with refillable bottles and single-use PET, which can be seen by that green triangle. It can also be seen that the lowest end of the ranges of all the alternatives, apart from the single-use glass, they are actually fairly similar. And it should also be noted that while the one-way PET, it seems slightly higher in the footprint than other formats, like aluminium cans and refillables in Europe, it also has the greatest carbon reduction potential, which can be seen by all that blue space below the green triangle. So from the current values, there can be a lot of reductions to be seen from using recycled content and improving recycling rates. You can also see that the refillable formats typically offer some carbon benefit over the one-way options, which can be further improved by reducing material weight, as well as maintaining high reuse rates, so limiting that breakage. This graph then shows the breakdown of that one-way PET range. So in here we have the different scenarios split out into the lowest and highest end values to make that range. And essentially what this demonstrates is that the lowest values are always produced with the high recycled content and high recycling rate, along with the renewable energy use. What you can also see from the blue and the grey is that the material and the stretch blow moulding are the most impactful life cycle stages of PET bottles, with the largest scope for reductions. This graph in comparison, so this is the refillable PET bottles. So it does show a reduction in overall emissions, despite this increase in transport in the dark blue, and then a new set of emissions from the bottle washing in the light blue. But it still does show that the material and the stretch blow moulding are still the most carbon intensive life cycle stages, again with room for improvement. So with these learnings in mind, this decarbonisation, we must see it across the whole value chain in parallel to see true reductions. So you can see this flow through the value chain, starting with raw materials that use recycled content and then developing a market through incentive, and then also just using less overall materials and not using plastics where it's needed, and then making those plastics lighter. We must also design specifically for recyclability, so aiming to be viable and widespread, and also have the availability of being upcycled, which just means being able to convert the material into something similar instead of converting plastic bottles into park benches, because there will soon be a time where we have enough park benches. We must then focus on reducing the production impact with low carbon electricity and/or energy efficiency. And then lastly, at the end of life, there must be effective collection and sorting accompanied by these technological recycling improvements like chemical recycling, as Sarah said, but only as an accompaniment and not plan A, with everything being designed for widespread mechanical recycling. So all of this value chain decarbonisation, it can be broken down into 3 key facilitators that are seen throughout the value chain. So the first that we keep mentioning is recycled content. So this graph just shows that the production of virgin plastics is continuing to grow. And the production of recycled plastics, it is also growing, but it still only makes up 6% of the total plastic production. And this is due to most sectors relying on virgin plastics for economic or quality reasons. However, there have been recent policies which have strengthened efforts to push supply through taxes on non-recycled plastic. And then we also have the pull of the demand for secondary plastic through recycled content targets. There's also been many public commitments to plastic, as Sarah mentioned, with WRAP's plastic pack and Ellen MacArthur's global commitment, which reference increasing recycled content as a key pledge into improving circularity. We then have recyclability as the other key facilitator. So recycling, of course, does generate some emissions, but this is small in comparison to the emissions saved from using recycled content and then not producing a new virgin plastic from oil. This can be seen from the graph on the right with recycling circled. You can see all in that blue is the virgin resin production at 61%, with the total emissions at the end of life only being 9%, with recycling just making up a small portion of this. When you look at a graph like this, you should also not confuse landfill for being a lower carbon option, even though it does look like it. It's just that plastics do not biodegrade, as we know, so they do not release those emissions unless they are burnt. But without recycling, there would be more raw resin needed to be produced. So everything should aim to be recycled so that these emissions cycle back in. And these net emissions and savings, they need to be accounted for within the plastic somewhere. So we follow the EU PEF circular footprint formula. And when you're calculating emissions, the net emissions need to be shared between the material and the end of life stages. In general, we use a 50-50 split for plastics, though it should be noted that as plastic becomes a commodity like aluminium and glass, as we hope, that this may alter to a 20-80 split, with 20% of the materials, the emissions going to the materials and 80% to the end of life to reflect the market value. So it's just interesting to see that these calculations will change as the market does. But overall, the recyclability and availability of recycled content, they go hand in hand as it's all one big circle. So the characteristics of plastic determines the quality of the recycler and then the value and the variety of use cases that it can be used in. So the last key facilitator is resource efficiency. And as has been shown, the majority of the plastic footprint, it comes from raw materials and manufacturing. So we need to use these resources as effectively as we can. So this can be achieved through a combination of reducing the energy intensity of the process, as well as the electricity grid factor through using renewables, and then also the actual amount of materials that we are using in the plastic in question. So for PET bottles in particular, this stretch blow molding, as shown in the soft drink report, they are relatively energy intensive. So the energy intensity and the carbon intensity used in this process can drive the footprint more than the recycled content or recycling rate sometimes. So overall, the resource efficiency is going to be a really important decarbonisation tool through limiting the amount of plastic inputs and emissions from manufacturing. I'm now going to pass back to Sarah, and she's going to talk about how this relates to our new proposition.
Thank you. So the next part of the webinar, we're going to give you an introduction to the plastic packaging framework, which we've been developing for the last year or so. What we're looking at in terms of how this framework is being assessed is that we're looking on packaging performance based on 3 key modules, which we've already outlined in the webinar today, which can help influence plastic circularity and reduce the emissions. The first, what becomes no surprise as we've already went through, is the recycled content. So we know that the use of recycled contents does reduce that reliance on virgin material and promotes that circularity. We've also heard from Juliet as well how that sort of accounting for recycled content can further reduce emissions, as we're not enabling the further production of virgin plastics and taking account of the advantage of using that as a secondary plastic source. The second pillar, if we look at that in terms of circularity, there's two different strands of this, and the first is technical recyclability. I mentioned further on at the beginning of the webinar in terms of how any plastic can be technically recycled, but we're looking at this in terms of designing for recyclability that ensures the effective recyclability of the packaging at its end of life. So whilst there may be a technology out there in some corner of the world, we're looking at this in terms of how that can be widespread. This comes into the practical recyclability side of this. So we're assessing that it's suitable for a mainstream recycling pathway and how those technical and practicality can complement each other for full circularity scoring. The final pillar looks at resource efficiency, and the two legs that we're looking at this is the design. So an efficient design which minimises the reliance on natural resources without compromising the packaging quality, and also leading to a reduction of the overall carbon footprint of the packaging. So within that low carbon packaging production, we're looking at endorsing and rewarding organisations who have taken into account that in that manufacturing process where many of the emissions do lie, that can be reduced through methods such as renewable energy or energy efficiency in terms of the equipment used. In terms of sort of standard criteria, this is quite a busy slide. I do appreciate it, but you will have access to this afterwards, and we will take questions on this. But in terms of the module description and sort of standard criteria, this gives you an idea in terms of what sort of evidence and examples we would be looking for to help sort of assess this framework for a packaging product. So for instance, the recycled content, we know that we're going to align to the UK's tax that's just been implemented this year, which has at least 30% recycled content, and when more, that would be rewarded in terms of a scoring. So things that could help evidence this is the use of secondary material in terms of proof of origin, in and outflows of the material and material specification documents as well. When we're looking at circularity, in terms of the technical recyclability, we've aligned with what we believe is best practice, which is a Recyclers online public tool. Important to highlight here, this is not a Recycler certification, and that should be obtained through themselves. But what they have developed is a very helpful public tool that can grade a product based on its recycling infrastructure at this present time. In terms of evidence, what we can have through that is going through the questionnaire with you, product specification, and a list of materials that are included in the packaging design. The practical element of the recyclability should be demonstrated by using the effective mainstream pathway. So looking at in terms of how that's communicated of recycling and evidence of label alignment with OPRL and product labels and instructions for the consumer to use. And finally, that resource efficiency, looking at design and low carbon production. So many clients that may have done life cycle analysis assessments with us, and we'll see some consistency and overlay from what the evidence that we're requesting. So the minimum pass requirement that we have for that is that you must have completed a life cycle assessment. It doesn't need to be external, but we do request that organisations at least understand the product carbon footprint of their packaging to date. So we're looking at things such as changes in the product weight, shape and size in comparisons, how you've reduced the packaging footprint or packaging design, tests behind those changes and choices, and looking at the low carbon production element, we're looking at things such as the life cycle assessment results, low carbon electricity certifications such as renewable guarantees of origin, or energy efficiency case studies that you've done on site, and further any carbon neutrality certifications as well, which could also help contribute towards the final assessment scoring. Worth highlighting as well in terms of what we're looking at within this framework is we're looking for organisations who are demonstrating improvements within their packaging design and want to sort of understand where further reductions can be unleashed to help work towards that decarbonisation of their product packaging and further improve the circularity. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Andrea from Hilton Food Group, who's went through a case study from our packaging framework assessment in the early days. So I'll hand over to Andrea now.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, all. So my name is Andrea Jex, and I'm Group Head of Procurement for Hilton Food Group. and I've been invited today, so thank you both to Sarah and Juliet. I've been invited today to talk to you about the process that we've been through, I guess as a bit of a guinea pig or a pilot with the Carbon Trust. Next slide, please. So just a brief introduction to Hilton Food Group. So we're not very well known, and you know, contrary to popular belief, we're not the Hilton hotel chain either. We are food manufacturers, and we partner with the #1 or #2 retailer within the country in which we operate. So most of our products are retailer own label, so we don't really have any brands, which is why we're sort of not well known. However, we do operate globally. We have around about 5,000 colleagues within the group. We have an annual turnover of 2.7 billion, and we operate in globally, and we have 18 modern, well-invested production facilities. So we pack meat, we pack fish, we have vegan and vegetarian. We also have food to go, so sandwiches, sauces, pizzas, etc. Innovation is a huge part of Hilton Food Group, and also sustainability. Automation, again, a huge part of Hilton Food Group, which is why, you know, when we're looking at packaging, that has to be fit for purpose. And we also sort not only for ourselves, but for other customers. Next slide, please. So sustainability is a huge part of Hilton Food Group. We have our programme, which is called Quality Naturally, and we focus in 3 areas, as most people do. So we have planet, we have people, and we have product. Packaging sits within product. We use an awful lot of plastic packaging, as you can imagine, and we work with a lot of different groups. You can see there, we were founder members of the UK Plastic Pact. We work with RAP, we work with RECU, we are part of the European Plastics Pact. We've done work with the Carbon Trust, as we mentioned. So, you know, looking at the sustainability of our packaging is a huge part of what we do. Next page, please. So we have worked with the Carbon Trust on 2 projects. We managed to pilot a carbon calculator. So instead of, we do use cardboard packaging, and we use plastic packaging. And you know, you talk to the plastic manufacturers, and they say that their product has a lower carbon content. And you talk to the board manufacturers, and they say the same. So we wanted to come up with an independent packaging calculator where we could compare different types of packaging. So we've worked with the Carbon Trust on that one. Also, we have worked with Juliet and Sarah on a Carbon Trust certified plastic packaging standard. So this is the framework that Sarah's just gone through. And we wanted to understand the true recyclability of our packaging. Next page, please. So the framework itself. So as I mentioned, worked with Juliet and Sarah and went through the framework. It was very simple. It was very easy to use. It was about gathering data. As Sarah mentioned earlier, you need to have an idea of your carbon footprint, and we'd already, as I've said, managed that project with the Carbon Trust, so that was a big tick for us to start from. So we use a lot of rPET plastic trays. They are they're recyclable, and they have a 100% recycled content. So we thought, great, our packs are really recyclable. But actually, having gone through the framework, we were very wrong. So we went through we looked at 4 options. We had option 1, which was a PET tray with a PET laminate lid. Then we went through a PET tray with a mono lid. We did that for both skin packaging and for MAP packaging. So we got a D. So we were very surprised. We thought, yeah, we're doing really, really well. Our packs are, 100% recycled content and fully recyclable. However, what you do, and I think a lot of people in the industry, looking at the groups that I work on, forget some of the other areas of their packaging. And this sort of reminded us that it's not just the tray that we're talking about here. So we passed on recycled content, as I mentioned, and we passed on resource efficiency. Where we failed was within circularity, and I'll just go through what it is that we highlighted that we needed to work on, and we are indeed working on these areas and sort of where we've got to. So, meat trays, pads. So a lot of trays need a pad for the liquor from the meat to make sure that the meat doesn't sit in that liquor, but also, you know, for life. We have been working for a while now on a project that means that we don't need pads within a tray. So it's the design of the tray, it takes the pads away. So that's a bit of a tick there, and we're actually just in supermarket trial as we speak. So that's going very well, which is great news, and we're hoping to be able to roll that out should this trial go well. What that also does is remove the adhesive that pads use. Within the tray. Now the adhesive, as per PETCOR guidelines, needs to be able to wash, and the adhesive that was used didn't, so that was a big no-no. However, if we get rid of pads, we also get rid of the pad adhesive. The trays that we use, they are rPET. They don't have a PE layer for sealing the film, but they do have a PE glue on the flange required for the film. We've been working with our supplier on coming up with glue that actually will wash off, again as per PETCOR guidelines, and again as we speak they're in trial, so we're hoping to be able to move over to that glue, and that glue will wash off through the recycling process. As I've just mentioned, PE layer on skin trays, so we do have skin trays where we have a PE layer. We are working again and are again in trial using a film that will enable us to take the PE layer away from the tray. Unfortunately, the film is still a complex laminate, so we've still got that issue to solve, but at least then we can say that our trays are mono and will become recyclable. Labels, again, a huge issue, so both from a paper substrate point of view, but also from the adhesive. So we have to make sure that the labels will wash off in one piece and don't pulp, and at the moment the labels that we had would pulp. So again, we're working both on our self-adhesive and our linerless labels with our supplier, and we have come up with a paper substrate that won't pulp. Also, again, the label adhesive, same issue as with the pad adhesive, they wouldn't wash off through the recycling process. So we have been trialing lots of different types of adhesive, and we've actually come to a solution on that one too. So that's not in trial yet, that's hot off the press, but we will be trialing that soon. Complex laminate lidding film and complex laminate skin film. This is still something that we have to solve. We are getting very close in terms of a laminate lidding film, but the laminate skin film is a difficult one. It needs to be able to adhere to the tray, have barrier, and obviously anything we do here, we make sure that we don't reduce the shelf life. So to be fair, 7 and 8, something we're still working on, but I think we're pretty happy that we're probably going to get solved 1 to 6 there that you can see on the slide. With that, we would have a potential score of a B. To get that B, that's to remove the label adhesive, but also to use padless trays. So yeah, it's been a very, very interesting exercise. I think it probably pulls out those issues that maybe people were sticking their head in the sand on, and also sort of identifies what you need to solve going forward. So yeah, I think that's enough from me. Hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavour on what we went through and the projects that have come out of it. I think, you know, for us, it really focused our minds on what we need to concentrate going forward. So thank you to Sarah and Juliet again, they've been fantastic, and yeah, that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was an excellent summary in terms of the overall project. It was an emotional project to go through last time when we were guinea pigging the overall framework, and your expertise was greatly appreciated. We're now coming towards the end of the webinar now, and what I wanted to do is just draw into the conclusions in terms of, can we actually decarbonise plastic to the point of a net zero economy? Because at the end of the day, that's what we're all aiming for in terms of making sure that global warming does not exceed 1.5. So despite the advances in the recycling sector and the uptake of recycled content, it would be naive to say that the plastic sector still doesn't face a significant challenge of change. What we're attempting to do is reverse a linear system that's been in place for over 60 years, as from the first slide that we showed in terms of that celebratory culture of a take, make and throw away system, and reducing greenhouse gases in the sector in parallel. So we know that many organisations and countries alike have set greenhouse gas target goals for a net zero economy and working towards a 1.5 degree world. But in doing that, consumerism and the trends that come with plastic sector are working against that, and it is a growing problem. What we need is a fast and coordinated system changes that are needed for all industries to align with climate mitigation circularity goals, but without a shared view of stakeholder positions, it's very difficult to achieve. What can happen within the plastic sector, as we've seen, opinions and priorities can become completely polarised, and opportunities for conversions and collective actions can be lost in the overall scheme. We know that across the value chain, upstream, production, manufacture and end of life, change is needed. There's no recycling solution, there's no upstream solution that will fix absolutely everything when it comes to the plastic sector, but more collective agreement that the entire value chain needs to improve going forward. The UN Treaty, we know, has the potential to be the biggest environmental agreement since Paris 2015, and there's great opportunity for both businesses and countries to improve their ways. We know that from Paris 2015, we're now on over 3,000 signatories for science-based targets in businesses, which is absolutely huge. We've seen the uptake of plastic pacts and pledges, and we hope that this continues and also strives to achieve those targets when it comes to 2025, and that most of them have set. But in order to unlock decarbonisation opportunities to their full potential, it is important for emissions to be quantified both at a product and a sector scale. It's not something that's easy to calculate on an annual basis, but if the treaty we know is serious on measuring progress against goals, it will be necessary to put into the treaty to make sure countries are aligning with that decarbonisation they've already previously agreed to. That is one of the key things that when designing the framework over the last year, we know that we couldn't, as the Carbon Trust, embed carbon reduction goals of our clients and what they've worked so hard to achieve, and not focus purely on plastic pollution, but more a realistic view in terms of how plastic can be decarbonised going forward to help organisations themselves achieve net zero state. I'm now going to hand over to some of the questions that we've been getting in on the webinar. We've had some really interesting questions coming in, so I think I'm going to hand over to Juliet first, who'll go through one of the key ones.
So one of the questions we've been asked is the framework assessing the main packaging component or includes all parts of the packaging, including the cap and label? And I think Andrea explained that really well, that the framework definitely does look at all parts of the packaging because the cap and label can sometimes be those important parts that are hindering recycling, which is why they are so important to see how the whole packaging works together. So as Hilton showed, the tray might be perfectly recyclable, but if the label doesn't detach right in the recycling process, then this will contaminate the tray recycler and it will not let the tray have its full recycling potential. And this is the same with caps that have a different polymer to the bottle, which these can contaminate the monomer recycler. So yeah, we definitely look at the entire packaging.
Fantastic. We also have a question on one of the graphs that we've shown from a report which looks at the recycling emissions, and does this include chemical recycling? This was taken from 2015 report, so what I'm anticipating is that within those recycling sector emissions, I anticipate it would be included. I don't anticipate the proportion of those emissions to be particularly large, depending on the fact that we are now in sort of a phase of upscaling chemical recycling technology to a wider standard. So what I would anticipate is that it would be included, but not necessarily a huge proportion of those overall emissions.
I can also see another question about how do you see the role of bio-based plastics and their role in decarbonising the plastic problem? So we thought we would probably get questions about bioplastics because we kind of didn't bring them up for a reason, just because it would be a whole other webinar. So it's good to see there are questions about them. And we do see bio-based plastics having a big role. but it's important to fight the confusion about bioplastics and what they are. So just to know that bioplastics, that can be a bio-based plastic or a biodegradable. It doesn't have to be both. So our favorite option for the future, if we were going to use a bio-based plastic, would be one that is also recyclable and not a biodegradable, preferably, just so that you have that circular economy of material being turned back into material and not needing to produce new bio-based materials. But yeah, bio-based biodegradables, they'll probably have a place where circular waste is not suitable, but we would just prefer them to be recyclable at the first instance. But yeah, it should also be noted that you can have bioplastics, which are fossil-based plastics that just biodegrade, and they can still technically be classed as a bioplastic. So yeah, those would be our least favorite, as these are just fossil plastics made from oil that biodegrade and leave plastic residues.
There's also a question in terms of how recycled material can be tested in terms of plastic product, and there are certifications that you can achieve that test recycled content specifically. So the way that we look at this within the framework is looking at evidence that supports that, and we're not scientists in a lab, so we can't do that ourselves, but there are many organizations that can certify that in terms of recycled content emissions, recycled content quantities rather, in terms of how that can be done. We also know that when embedding recycled content, there are different approaches to take, such as mass balance versus segregation, and some key organizations can test that within laboratory sample testing to see what has been used to have that in the product.
And there is another question about so paper labels. Why would you choose a paper label on a PET product? So Andrea might want to jump in and help answer this, but from what we learned through this process, that a paper label on PET is technically fine as long as the adhesive releases it in the water so that the paper can float away easily, and then you just have the PET left uncontaminated. But in terms of if a PET label on a PET tray would be better, that would be something that would be interesting to assess from a carbon and recyclability assessment. But yeah, every product is so different, it's hard to say what is the best option. So it would be good to assess that as long as the adhesives holding on that PET don't get in the way, because yeah, normally how it works would be that the label would float away. So we wouldn't want that PET to get lost and go to landfill.
We also have a question on in terms of how long the framework can take, up to in terms of overall timescales. So whilst we've worked with Hilton, which was a sort of our pilot client, this was sort of pathfinding. So there's a lot of to and fro in terms of how that could have been developed, and Hilton also helped improve our overall framework and key considerations. Normally, in terms of how this has now evolved and how we've developed it going forward, we anticipate this would take up to 12 weeks in terms of how that would be from start to finish, and we assess the evidence requirements and make sure that we have key points of contact in terms of workshops and key discussions with the relevant stakeholders within an organisation to make sure that's being discussed internally, and making sure that the recommendations that we're providing aren't in vain and can actually be applied practically. Andrea, I don't know if you have anything to add on the previous question, but we do have another one which is looked at, have you considered adding PCR content to labels as well, and looking at changing paper labels to plastic PCR to avoid plastic tasks and monomaterial approach for improved recyclability? I don't know if you would like to answer that.
Just on the first one, I think Juliet was absolutely right. You know, different labels are used for different reasons. However, it's the adhesive that we need to get right there, whether it's a paper label that floats off or you use a PET label. Obviously, the adhesive has got to allow that either to float off or not contaminate the stream. I think that's my comment on the label one. And could you just repeat what you asked me, please, on the second one?
Yes, so the second question was, have you considered adding PCR content to labels as well, or changing paper labels to plastic PCR to avoid plastic tax and go for monomaterial approach for improved recyclability?
We use PET labels where we might, in countries, for example, in Australia, where we have long logistical, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, things get travel a long way, let's put it that way. But also we have the humidity there. So we would use PET labels there. And yes, we are looking at adding recycled content where we can. But we do tend to use paper if we don't need to use PET.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrea. That wraps up in terms of the question proportion of the webinar. So I'm now going to move on in terms of just looking at how plastic mismanages both a carbon and waste problem, and looking at what else we do in the space below. So Juliet and I and many members of the team within business services have been working in the plastic sector for many years and have many projects that we've had across different suppliers and different key clients, such as product footprinting and certification that we've had with many organisations, carbon neutrality, comparative soft drink footprints of different material manufacturing and refill characteristics, which we've included within our webinar today. That is on our online website as well, should you wish to download that and read. We also have developed a custom footprinting tool for a major retailer of the existing plastic packaging and comparisons and scenarios when altering characteristics. So this is something that is a live model that can look at different SKUs on an annual basis to see if there's key shifts that can be changed within the packaging material and how that can contribute to their net zero goals. We've also do organisational and value chain footprints for plastic manufacturers within the space and many organisations within the plastic sector, and also science-based target setting and net zero and looking at feasibility studies, so how that can be achieved on an organisational basis whilst also a product basis as well. And that's everything that we wanted to go through in terms of the webinar today. Thank you so much for joining. We hope you have a good rest of the day, and any questions that you wish to send can be sent through the website and also through myself and Juliet. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.